Sometimes the smallest moment of disrespect reveals the biggest truth about power. It was just after 5:30 on a mild spring evening in a quiet neighborhood park on the edge of Richmond, Virginia, the kind of place where people walk their dogs after work and kids rode bicycles along the cracked concrete path that looped around a patch of old oak trees. The sun hung low over the treetops, casting long golden shadows across the grass, and the air smelled faintly of fresh soil and blooming magnolias drifting in from the nearby streets. Near a worn wooden bench beside a small gravel walkway, an elderly woman knelt slowly with careful movements, placing small metal bowls on the ground one by one. She moved with patience, the kind that only comes from many years of routine, her gray coat folded neatly around her shoulders and a soft knitted hat resting over tightly curled silver hair. From beneath the hedges and tree roots, shapes began to appear. Thin orange cats, a shy gray tabby, a black kitten with bright, curious eyes, each approaching cautiously as if they already knew her. The woman smiled quietly to herself, opening a large paper bag and pouring dry food into the bowls while speaking in a gentle voice barely louder than the rustling leaves. To anyone passing by, she looked like someone's grandmother simply enjoying a peaceful evening, the kind of person most people would barely notice before continuing on their way. Her name was Evelyn Carter, and every evening at nearly the same time, she walked the half-mile from her small brick townhouse to this exact spot to feed the stray cats that had slowly come to depend on her. Some of them had been showing up for years, and she knew each one by its markings the way other people recognized neighbors. The park was quiet except for the soft crunch of paws on gravel and the distant laughter of teenagers near the basketball court, and for a moment the world felt calm, ordinary, almost gentle. But calm moments have a strange way of changing without warning. From the far end of the path came the sharp sound of boots striking pavement with authority, followed by the faint crackle of a police radio clipped to a dark blue uniform. Officer Daniel Brooks stepped into the open space beside the bench, his posture stiff and impatient, scanning the ground with a disapproving expression as he noticed the bowls, the cats, and the elderly woman kneeling beside them. Brooks had been on patrol for most of the afternoon responding to minor complaints, noise reports, parking disputes, the usual routine that left him tired and irritated by the time evening rolled in. When his eyes landed on the feeding bowls scattered across the gravel, his jaw tightened immediately. "Ma'am," he called out in a firm voice that echoed louder than necessary across the quiet park. "You can't be doing that here." Evelyn slowly lifted her head, blinking once behind thin reading glasses as if returning from a peaceful thought. She didn't seem startled, only mildly curious, the way someone might respond to an unexpected question during a calm conversation. Around her, the cats paused but didn't run, watching the officer carefully. The breeze shifted through the oak branches above them, sending a few dry leaves spiraling down onto the path. Officer Brooks stepped closer, his tone growing sharper as he gestured toward the bowls. "Feeding stray animals in public parks violates city sanitation rules," he said flatly, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to giving orders. Evelyn rose slowly to her feet, brushing dust from her coat with calm, steady hands. Her expression remained composed, almost thoughtful, as if she were measuring every word before speaking. "I understand your concern, officer," she replied softly, her voice clear despite her age, "but they've been coming here for years. I clean up after them. I make sure the area stays tidy." The officer barely listened, already shaking his head as though the explanation didn't matter. A couple walking their dog slowed nearby, sensing tension in the air, while a teenage girl seated on a bench across the walkway glanced up from her phone with quiet curiosity. The peaceful evening had shifted, not with shouting or chaos, but with that subtle change in tone when authority meets patience. Brooks crossed his arms and looked down at the bowls again with visible irritation, unaware that the quiet woman standing in front of him had spent 3 decades inside federal courtrooms where the meaning of authority was something far more complicated than a uniform or a badge. Officer Daniel Brooks did not move as Evelyn Carter finished speaking. For a moment, he simply stared at the bowls arranged on the gravel path. As if the small metal dishes themselves were an insult to the order he believed he was responsible for maintaining. The cats, sensing the tension, began eating quietly but cautiously, their ears flicking at every shift in the officer's voice. The orange one closest to the bench paused mid-bite and glanced upward, as though trying to understand why the peaceful routine had suddenly changed. Brooks exhaled slowly through his nose, the sound carrying the impatience of someone who had already decided how the conversation would end. City rules are city rules, he said firmly, gesturing toward the ground again. People start feeding them. They multiply. Then the park becomes a problem for sanitation and complaints. I have seen it happen before. Evelyn listened without interrupting. Her posture remained relaxed, shoulders slightly rounded with age but steady, her hands resting calmly at her sides. The breeze lifted a corner of her gray coat, and for a brief second the late sunlight caught the edge of a simple gold watch around her wrist, the kind of watch someone might have worn for many years without ever replacing it. "Officer," she said gently, "I come here every evening around this time. I clean up the bowls afterward. Nothing stays behind." Brooks shook his head again, his patience thinning. "That is not the point. The point is that you are not supposed to feed stray animals in the park." His voice carried just far enough that the couple walking their golden retriever slowed their steps again, lingering near the path while pretending to adjust the dog's leash. The teenage girl across the walkway lowered her phone slightly, curiosity replacing whatever message she had been typing before. Evelyn glanced down at the bowls for a moment, watching the gray tabby finish eating before quietly licking its paw. The routine of feeding them had never been about breaking rules. It had started almost 4 years earlier after she noticed a thin kitten hiding beneath the same bench during a winter morning walk. One bowl of food had become 2, then 3, and eventually the cats simply learned that this quiet corner of the park offered a dependable meal and a calm presence. In a world that had once demanded constant decisions and sharp judgment from her, this small responsibility had become something simple and grounding. Brooks stepped forward another foot, now standing only a few yards away from the bench. "You are going to need to pack that up," he said, his tone no longer patient, but clearly final. "Right now." Evelyn looked at him carefully, her eyes thoughtful behind the thin lenses of her glasses. She had spent decades observing voices exactly like his inside courtrooms across the country, voices filled with certainty, voices convinced that authority always meant being correct. Yet the years had also taught her something else about authority. True authority rarely needed to raise its voice. "They will finish in just a minute," she replied calmly, gesturing toward the cats still eating. "Then I will collect the bowls and head home." Brooks let out a short, humorless laugh. "That is not how this works. When an officer gives an instruction, it means immediately." The teenage girl across the path raised her phone again, this time not for texting, but for quietly recording. She was not sure why the moment felt important, but something about the tension in the officer's voice made her instincts tell her to capture it. The dog walker couple exchanged a glance, but remained silent. Evelyn did not react to the raised tone. Instead, she looked at the cats one more time, waiting patiently while the smallest black kitten finished the last few bites in its bowl. The evening sun dipped slightly lower behind the oak trees, stretching the shadows longer across the gravel path. Brooks folded his arms, clearly irritated by the lack of urgency in her response. To him, the situation was simple. A rule had been broken. A warning had been given. Compliance should have followed immediately. What he did not realize, what none of the small gathering of witnesses realized yet, was that the quiet woman standing beside those feeding bowls had spent more than 30 years interpreting the meaning of rules at the highest levels of the federal justice system. And the calm patience she showed now was not weakness. It was experience. Officer Daniel Brooks shifted his weight impatiently as the last of the cats finished eating, the quiet crunch of dry food fading into the soft rustle of wind through the oak leaves above. To him, the entire scene felt unnecessary, an interruption to a patrol shift that had already tested his patience with small complaints and minor calls. The elderly woman standing calmly beside the bench did not look like someone who understood how things worked in his world. In his mind, authority moved quickly, decisions were immediate, and instructions were expected to be followed without hesitation. Yet the woman in front of him seemed to exist at a completely different pace, one that refused to rush simply because his voice demanded it. Evelyn Carter bent slowly at the waist and began collecting the empty bowls with careful movements, wiping each one with a small cloth from her pocket before placing them neatly into the same paper bag she had carried into the park. The cats lingered nearby, circling her feet in quiet gratitude before wandering back toward the bushes and shaded corners where they spent most of their days. She moved with the calm discipline of someone who had followed routines far more complex than feeding stray animals, someone who had spent years measuring her words and actions with deliberate care. For decades, her mornings had begun before sunrise in a quiet Washington townhouse, where stacks of legal briefs waited beside a cup of black coffee, and her evenings often ended long after courthouse lights had dimmed. Inside federal courtrooms, she had listened to arguments that carried consequences far beyond a single moment, decisions that shaped lives, businesses, even entire communities. She had learned long ago that the loudest voice in the room was rarely the one with the strongest understanding of justice. Officer Brooks watched her silently for a few seconds before speaking again. "You should have packed that up the moment I told you," he said, his tone edged with irritation that had been building since he first approached. Evelyn straightened slowly, the paper bag now folded neatly under one arm. She looked toward the gravel path where the couple with the golden retriever still lingered several yards away, and where the teenage girl remained seated on the bench with her phone loosely angled toward the scene. The park had grown quieter, as if the evening itself had paused to observe how the moment would unfold. "They are finished now," Evelyn replied gently. "Everything is cleaned and ready to go." Brooks did not seem satisfied with that answer. His gaze shifted briefly toward the teenage girl holding the phone, then back to Evelyn. "Next time you should not start in the first place," he said. The words hung in the warm evening air longer than expected. Evelyn met his eyes calmly, not with defiance, but with a quiet steadiness that seemed to puzzle him. People he encountered during patrol usually reacted one of two ways when confronted by authority. They either argued loudly or apologized quickly. The composed silence of this woman did neither. She simply observed him with the thoughtful patience of someone who had spent many years listening before speaking. "Officer Brooks," she said after a moment, reading his name from the metal badge on his chest, "may I ask you something?" The use of his name caught him slightly off guard, though he did not show it. "What?" he replied curtly. Evelyn gestured lightly toward the empty space where the cats had been eating only moments earlier. "When you enforce a rule," she said softly, "do you ever stop to ask why the rule exists in the first place?" Brooks frowned immediately, as though the question itself were unnecessary. "It exists because the city wrote it," he answered. Evelyn nodded slowly, absorbing the response without judgment. She had heard that same reasoning in countless forms during the long years she spent interpreting the law. Yet standing there in the fading light of a neighborhood park, she realized something familiar about the officer's certainty. It reminded her of young attorneys who once stood in her courtroom convinced that authority was simply a matter of who spoke the loudest. But experience had always revealed a deeper truth. Rules without understanding rarely produce justice. As the breeze stirred the leaves above them once more, the quiet tension between the officer and the retired judge lingered in the air, unnoticed by the man who believed he was the only authority standing in that park. Officer Daniel Brooks stared at Evelyn Carter for a long moment after her question, the kind of look someone gives when they are unsure whether they have just been challenged or simply confused. The fading sunlight filtered through the oak branches above them, scattering warm orange light across the gravel path and the empty feeding spot where the cats had gathered only minutes earlier. For Brooks, the conversation had already lasted longer than he believed it should have. Patrol work, in his mind, was about clear lines. Someone broke a rule, the officer corrected the behavior, and the situation ended. The calm tone of the elderly woman standing in front of him disrupted that simple order, and the fact that she had spoken his name only made the moment feel more uncomfortable than he wanted to admit. "I do not need to ask why a rule exists," he replied stiffly. "My job is to enforce it." Evelyn listened without interrupting, the same patient expression resting on her face. She had heard that sentence in different forms more times than she could count during the long years she spent presiding over federal hearings. In courtrooms filled with tension, attorneys often argued over the exact same idea, the difference between enforcing the letter of the law and understanding the purpose behind it. The quiet park around them felt strangely similar to those courtrooms now, even though the only sounds were distant traffic, rustling leaves, and the occasional bark of the golden retriever still standing with its owners a few yards away. Brooks glanced briefly toward the small audience forming near the path. The couple with the dog pretended to adjust the leash again, though their attention remained fixed on the conversation. The teenage girl across the walkway held her phone steady in both hands, the screen reflecting the last light of the evening sun. Brooks did not like being observed. It made the situation feel larger than it was supposed to be. "Look," he said, lowering his voice slightly but tightening his tone. "The park has rules for a reason. Feeding stray animals attracts more of them. People complain. The city gets involved. It becomes a problem that officers like me have to deal with." Evelyn nodded once, acknowledging the explanation without arguing. "I understand how responsibilities work, Officer Brooks," she replied gently. "I spent many years in a profession built entirely around them." Brooks did not catch the deeper meaning in that statement. To him, it sounded like the polite response of someone trying to appear reasonable while still refusing to accept correction. He stepped a little closer, the gravel crunching under his boots. "Then you should understand why I cannot allow this to continue," he said. "If I see it again, it will not just be a warning." The words were not shouted, but they carried a clear edge of authority meant to end the conversation. Evelyn looked down briefly at the paper bag tucked under her arm, making sure the bowls inside were secured before lifting her gaze back toward the officer. The park had grown noticeably quieter now. Even the dog had stopped tugging at its leash, standing still as if sensing the tension that had settled over the path. "You are concerned about order," Evelyn said calmly. "That is a reasonable concern." Brooks waited for the apology he expected to follow, but it never came. Instead, she continued speaking in the same measured tone. "But sometimes maintaining order also requires understanding the people involved." Brooks frowned again. The conversation felt as though it was moving in circles, and he had little patience left for philosophical discussions during a routine patrol. "Ma'am," he said sharply, "this is not a debate." The word hung in the air between them. For a brief second, Evelyn almost smiled, though it was not a mocking expression. It was the quiet recognition of how familiar the moment felt. For decades, lawyers had stood in front of her courtroom declaring the exact same thing, convinced that their interpretation of authority left no room for discussion. Yet time had always revealed a deeper truth about authority. It was not measured by how quickly someone could silence a conversation. It was measured by how carefully they understood it. Brooks folded his arms again, clearly ready to walk away once he believed the issue had been settled. What he did not realize was that the calm woman standing in front of him had spent 30 years deciding how the law itself should be interpreted, and the patience in her voice came from experience far beyond the small patch of gravel where the evening's conversation had begun. Officer Daniel Brooks let out a short breath through his nose, clearly done with the conversation in his mind. The fading sunlight had now dipped lower behind the line of oak trees, and long shadows stretched across the gravel path like quiet lines dividing the small park into pieces of light and shade. The couple with the golden retriever remained near the edge of the walkway, no longer pretending to be distracted. The teenage girl across the path continued holding her phone steady, the small lens reflecting the amber glow of the evening sky. Brooks noticed the phone again, and his expression tightened slightly, the awareness of being watched adding a new edge to his posture. "You can talk about understanding all you want," he said firmly, "but rules are not optional. The park has them. The city expects them to be followed. And when I say something needs to stop, that should be the end of it." Evelyn Carter remained still as he spoke, her calm presence almost unchanged despite the growing tension around them. She had heard voices like his many times before, voices filled with the certainty that authority alone settled every question. In courtrooms, that kind of certainty often collapsed the moment someone asked a deeper question. But standing here in the quiet park, she did not challenge him the way she might have during her years on the bench. Instead, she simply observed him, the way someone observes a young lawyer who has not yet learned how complicated the law can be. Brooks gestured toward the empty ground where the feeding bowls had been only minutes earlier. "You may think this is harmless," he continued, "but small things become big problems when nobody stops them early." Evelyn nodded once, acknowledging his concern without arguing against it. "That is often true," she said quietly. Her voice carried the calm tone of someone used to weighing every word before speaking. Brooks seemed briefly thrown off by the agreement. For a moment he expected another question, another slow explanation, but none came. Instead, Evelyn simply stood there with the folded paper bag under her arm, waiting as if the conversation might still lead somewhere meaningful. The silence stretched long enough that the golden retriever finally shifted its paws against the path, the soft scrape of gravel breaking the quiet. Brooks glanced toward the dog and its owners again before looking back at Evelyn. Something about her composure unsettled him. Most people in this situation would have either walked away quickly or started arguing loudly. She had done neither. She had simply listened. "Next time," Brooks said at last, "do not bring the food here at all." His tone was not raised, but it carried the unmistakable weight of a command. Evelyn looked around the park slowly, her eyes moving from the bench to the bushes where the cats had disappeared and finally to the wide path leading toward the streetlights beginning to flicker on in the distance. The evening air had cooled slightly, carrying the faint smell of fresh grass and distant traffic. "Officer Brooks," she said gently after a moment, "do you know how long these cats have been coming here?" The question sounded simple, almost harmless. Brooks frowned again, clearly not interested in continuing the discussion. "No," he answered shortly, "and it does not matter." Evelyn's expression softened slightly, not with disagreement, but with understanding. "For 4 years," she said quietly. "Every evening." Brooks gave a small dismissive shrug. "Then it should have been stopped 4 years ago." The words were meant to end the matter completely. Yet the moment they left his mouth, the teenage girl across the path shifted slightly on the bench, the camera of her phone adjusting its angle, as if capturing every second more carefully now. The couple with the golden retriever exchanged another glance. Something in the officer's tone had made the quiet scene feel heavier than before. Evelyn did not react to the dismissal the way Brooks expected. Instead, she gave a small nod, as though acknowledging a point made in a courtroom discussion long ago. "For years," she repeated softly. Then she lifted her gaze to meet his again, calm and steady beneath the dimming evening sky, the patience in her eyes hinting that the conversation was not quite as simple as he believed it to be. Officer Daniel Brooks shifted his stance again, clearly expecting the conversation to end after his last remark, but the quiet repetition of "for years" lingered in the air longer than he liked. The sun had now slipped behind the tallest oak tree at the edge of the park, leaving the sky a deep amber that slowly faded into early evening blue. Streetlights along the sidewalk flickered on one by one, casting soft circles of pale light across the gravel path. The park was nearly empty now except for the small group that had unintentionally become witnesses to a conversation that seemed to carry more weight than anyone had expected when it began. Brooks glanced briefly toward the teenage girl with the phone again, noticing that she had not stopped recording. The device was held steady with both hands, her face calm, but focused as though she sensed that something important was unfolding even if she could not yet explain why. The couple with the golden retriever remained nearby as well, the dog now sitting quietly beside them as if the tension in the air had instructed even the animal to remain still. Brooks cleared his throat, his voice returning to the firm tone of someone used to closing discussions. "For years does not change the rule," he said. "If anything, it means this should have been addressed sooner." Evelyn Carter listened carefully before responding. Her eyes moved briefly across the park again, the familiar space where she had walked nearly every evening for the past several years. The same bench, the same bushes where the cats waited each night. The same narrow path leading back toward the street where her small townhouse stood less than half a mile away. Routine had a quiet way of anchoring a person after a long life of decisions and responsibilities. Feeding the cats had never been about the animals alone. It had been about something steady in a world that had once demanded constant judgment from her. "Perhaps," she said softly, "but sometimes a routine also tells you something about a place." Brooks frowned slightly, not following her meaning. "What does that even mean?" he asked. Evelyn gave a small, thoughtful pause before answering. "It means that a community often reveals itself through the smallest habits people keep," she said. "The way neighbors greet each other. The way people care for things that do not belong to them." Brooks let out a quiet breath that sounded closer to frustration now. Philosophical conversations were not what he wanted at the end of a patrol shift. "Ma'am, I am not here for a lecture," he said. "I am here to make sure the park rules are followed." Evelyn nodded again. She had expected that answer. It was the kind of certainty she had seen in young officials many times during her years in government buildings and courtrooms. Authority often began with rules. Understanding usually came later. She adjusted the paper bag slightly under her arm before speaking again. "May I ask you one more question, Officer Brooks?" she said calmly. Brooks hesitated for a moment before responding, clearly reluctant but unwilling to appear dismissive in front of the small group watching. "One," he replied shortly. Evelyn looked directly at him, her expression still composed and steady. "If a rule is enforced without understanding the people it affects," she asked, "do you believe it always produces fairness?" Brooks did not answer immediately. The question was not complicated, yet it did not fit into the simple categories he preferred during his work. He shifted his weight again, the gravel beneath his boots crunching softly in the quiet park. "Fairness is not my job," he said finally. "Following the rule is." Evelyn considered that answer carefully. For a moment, the only sound in the park was the distant hum of a passing car on the nearby street and the soft rustling of leaves overhead. Then she gave a small nod as though a familiar thought had just been confirmed. "That is an interesting distinction," she said quietly. Brooks did not notice the subtle change in the mood around them, but the teenage girl holding the phone leaned forward slightly on the bench, sensing that the conversation had reached a moment she did not want to miss. What Officer Daniel Brooks still did not realize was that the woman standing in front of him had spent more than 3 decades deciding how rules and fairness should meet each other inside the federal justice system, and the calm patience in her voice carried the quiet weight of someone who had once held the final word on exactly that question. Officer Daniel Brooks held his posture rigid after answering Evelyn Carter's question, convinced that the conversation had already gone further than it needed to. The streetlights along the park path now glowed steadily, replacing the last traces of sunlight with a pale white glow that stretched across the gravel walkway and the quiet bench where the evening had begun. The park felt different now, no longer simply a quiet place where someone fed stray cats, but a space where a small moment of authority had drawn the attention of strangers who sensed something unusual unfolding. Brooks adjusted the radio on his shoulder as if preparing to leave, his mind already moving toward the next patrol stop on his route. "If that was your last question," he said firmly, "then this conversation is finished." Evelyn Carter watched him for a moment, her calm expression unchanged. The years had taught her how often people mistook patience for agreement. She had spent decades sitting behind a high wooden bench in federal courtrooms where arguments unfolded exactly like this one. Voices full of certainty standing across from quiet questions that often carried deeper meaning than anyone realized at first. The difference now was that she no longer needed to decide the outcome of anything. She was simply an observer again, something she had not been for most of her professional life. "Very well," she said softly. "Then I will not take more of your time." Brooks gave a small nod, satisfied that the situation had finally reached its conclusion. Yet as he turned slightly toward the path, preparing to step away, a quiet voice broke the stillness from behind him. "Excuse me." The word came from the teenage girl sitting on the bench across the walkway. Brooks paused and turned halfway back toward her, irritation flickering briefly across his face at being interrupted. The girl stood slowly, holding her phone carefully in one hand. She looked nervous but determined at the same time, as though she had been debating whether to speak for several minutes. "Officer," she said politely, "I just wanted to ask something." Brooks exhaled quietly. "What is it?" he replied. The girl hesitated before continuing, glancing once toward Evelyn before speaking again. "The woman you are talking to," she said carefully. "Her name is Evelyn Carter, right?" Brooks looked at Evelyn for a brief moment, and then back at the girl. "That is what she said," he answered. The girl nodded slowly. "I think I have seen her before," she continued. "My uncle works downtown, near the federal courthouse. He showed me a picture once when we were talking about important cases from years ago." Brooks frowned slightly, unsure where the conversation was heading. "And?" he asked. The girl swallowed once before speaking again, her voice steadier now. "He said there used to be a judge there named Evelyn Carter. A federal judge. He said she was one of the toughest judges in the whole district." The words hung in the air like a quiet bell that had just been struck. Brooks stared at the girl for a moment before letting out a short, dismissive laugh. "There are a lot of people named Carter," he said. "That does not mean anything." The girl shifted her weight slightly, but did not lower the phone still recording in her hand. "Maybe," she said. Then she looked directly at Evelyn again. But the picture looked exactly like her. The couple standing with the golden retriever exchanged another glance, their attention now fully drawn to the exchange. Brooks looked back toward Evelyn Carter again, this time studying her more carefully. The gray coat, the quiet posture, the steady gaze that had never once shown fear or anger during the entire conversation. 4. The first time since arriving at the park, a small trace of uncertainty crept into his expression. Evelyn did not speak immediately. She simply met his eyes calmly, the same patient composure she had carried through thousands of courtroom proceedings during her long career. Finally, she gave a small nod toward the girl on the bench. "Your uncle remembers correctly," she said gently. "I served as a federal judge for many years before retiring." The quiet park fell completely silent. Even the distant hum of traffic seemed to fade for a moment as the meaning of her words settled over the small group standing beneath the streetlights. For several seconds no one in the park said a word. The quiet statement settled into the evening air with a weight that felt larger than the simple sentence itself. Officer Daniel Brooks remained standing on the gravel path, his shoulders squared in the same posture he had held throughout the entire encounter. But the certainty that had filled his voice earlier was suddenly less visible. The streetlight above the bench cast a soft circle of white light over the ground, illuminating the empty feeding spot where the cats had gathered only a few minutes earlier. Somewhere in the bushes a faint rustle suggested that one of them had returned to watch the humans again. Brooks looked directly at Evelyn Carter now, studying her face more carefully than he had at any point since arriving. The calm composure he had interpreted as stubbornness suddenly appeared different when placed beside the quiet authority in her words. "You were a federal judge," he repeated slowly, as though testing the idea aloud to see if it made sense. Evelyn gave a small nod. "For 32 years, she replied in the same gentle tone. The teenage girl on the bench lowered her phone slightly, but did not stop recording. Her eyes moved back and forth between the officer and the elderly woman, sensing that the moment had shifted in a way that would stay with her long after she left the park that night. The couple with the golden retriever stood quietly nearby, their earlier curiosity replaced by a more thoughtful silence. Brooks adjusted the radio on his shoulder again, though this time the movement seemed less like routine and more like someone searching for a moment to think. His mind replayed the conversation from the beginning, the calm questions, the patience, the lack of fear or anger. Suddenly those details made a different kind of sense. "You did not mention that earlier," he said finally. Evelyn Carter looked toward the path where the cats had disappeared and then back to the officer. "You did not ask," she answered gently. The response was not sarcastic. It was simply factual. Brooks looked down at the gravel for a moment, his boots shifting slightly as though he were reconsidering the entire interaction. Authority had always been simple in his mind. Rules existed. Officers enforced them. Situations ended. Yet standing here now, he realized something uncomfortable about the conversation he had just had. The woman in front of him had spent decades interpreting the very laws that officers like him were trained to enforce. And through the entire exchange, she had never raised her voice or tried to overpower the situation. She had only asked questions. The teenage girl on the bench took a cautious step closer. Her phone still pointed gently in their direction, but no longer held as rigidly as before. "My uncle said you were known for being fair," she said quietly to Evelyn. Evelyn gave the girl a warm smile that softened the lines of age around her eyes. "I tried to be," she replied. The simple answer carried a quiet humility that made the small group around them even more aware of the contrast between the calm woman and the tension that had filled the conversation earlier. Brooks lifted his gaze again, meeting Evelyn's eyes with a different expression now, one that held less certainty and more reflection. "I enforce the rules the city gives us," he said slowly. Evelyn nodded. "I understand that," she replied. Then she added one more sentence, her voice steady and calm beneath the glow of the streetlights. "But sometimes the purpose of a rule becomes clearer when we remember who the rule is meant to serve." The words were not an accusation. They sounded more like a reminder, the kind someone might offer a student rather than an opponent. Brooks did not respond immediately. The quiet park seemed to hold the moment with unusual stillness, as though the evening itself was waiting to see what the officer would do next. Officer Daniel Brooks stood quietly on the gravel path as Evelyn Carter's final words settled into the evening air. The park no longer felt tense in the way it had only minutes earlier, yet the silence that followed carried a different kind of weight, one that came from reflection rather than confrontation. The streetlights now illuminated the entire walkway, casting soft circles of pale light across the grass and the wooden bench where the evening routine had begun. Somewhere behind the bushes, the faint sound of paws moving through dry leaves suggested that one of the cats had returned cautiously, as if curious whether the humans had finished their discussion. Brooks let out a slow breath and looked around the park for a moment, noticing details he had overlooked earlier. The quiet neighborhood beyond the trees, the peaceful stillness of the path, the way the elderly woman stood calmly beneath the streetlight, holding a simple paper bag that contained nothing more than a few empty feeding bowls. The situation he had approached as a problem suddenly appeared smaller and more human than it had at the beginning of the encounter. He turned his attention back to Evelyn Carter and spoke again, though this time his voice carried less sharpness than before. "You said you served as a judge for 32 years, he said slowly. Evelyn nodded once. "That is correct." Brooks paused again, choosing his next words more carefully than he had earlier in the conversation. "Then you spent a long time deciding how laws should be applied." Evelyn offered a quiet smile that held neither pride nor defensiveness. "I spent many years listening," she replied. "The decisions came after that." The teenage girl who had been recording lowered her phone slightly, the tension in her shoulders easing now that the exchange no longer sounded confrontational. The couple with the golden retriever relaxed their grip on the leash as well, the dog wagging its tail once as if sensing the change in atmosphere. Brooks looked down the path again and then back toward Evelyn. For the first time since arriving at the park, he seemed less like an officer delivering instructions and more like a person reconsidering a moment that had moved too quickly. "Those cats," he said quietly, gesturing toward the bushes where the faint rustling continued. "They have really been coming here every evening for 4 years." Evelyn nodded again. "Every evening," she said. Brooks looked toward the empty feeding spot under the streetlight and then back at the woman standing calmly in front of him. The rule he had quoted earlier still existed. The city had written it. Officers were expected to enforce it. Yet standing there now, he realized something that had not occurred to him when the encounter began. Rules were written for communities, and communities were made of people with lives, habits, and quiet responsibilities that did not always appear in official language. Brooks straightened slightly and gave a small nod. "I understand your routine," he said. Evelyn did not respond immediately. She simply watched him with the same steady patience she had carried through the entire evening. Brooks shifted his weight once more before speaking again. "Just make sure the area stays clean," he added. "If anyone asks, I expect the park to look the same tomorrow as it did today." The statement was not exactly permission, but it was no longer a demand either. It was something closer to understanding. Evelyn Carter's expression softened into a warm smile. "It always does," she said gently. Brooks gave a final nod and turned toward the path leading back toward the street, the quiet crunch of gravel beneath his boots fading slowly as he walked away from the bench. The teenage girl lowered her phone completely now, looking from Evelyn to the bushes where the cats had begun to reappear one by one. The couple with the golden retriever continued their evening walk down the path, the dog happily sniffing the ground again as if the park had returned to its ordinary rhythm. Evelyn Carter waited a moment longer beneath the streetlight before walking slowly toward the bushes. The smallest black kitten emerged first, followed by the gray tabby and the orange cat that had arrived earlier. Evelyn reached into her coat pocket and produced a small handful of dry food she had saved before packing the bowls away. She scattered the pieces gently across the gravel, watching the animals gather again under the quiet glow of the park lights. The evening returned to its peaceful rhythm, and as the soft sounds of paws and rustling leaves filled the air once more, one simple truth lingered in the calm silence of the park. Authority can command attention, but respect is always earned through understanding.